So where's the de-escalation between Russia and Ukraine? After Sunday's direct standoff between the two nations' fleets off the coast of Crimea, the general conclusion was there was quite a bit of grandstanding for domestic purposes on both sides, and that neither Moscow nor Kiev stood to benefit from a spiral that could lead to all-out war. However, neither side is backing down, what with Russia following up the sentencing of 24 Ukrainian sailors by announcing the deployment of a new battery of anti-aircraft missiles to Crimea, Petro Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president, imposing martial law in frontline regions. The Kremlin's calculation that, well, the consequences will be slight. Yes, Donald Trump might cancel a side meeting with Vladimir Putin at this week's G20 summit in Argentina. There is talk of fresh sanctions against Moscow and Brussels. But Washington wonders aloud if the EU has the stomach for this fight. An increasing number of the bloc's members, like Austria and Italy, include ruling parties that are openly tied to Moscow, and powerhouses like Germany who rely on Russian gas. More broadly, what are the perils of ignoring what has become a permanent state of conflict in eastern Ukraine? What does it say about the world order as it stands now? Today in the France24 Debate, we're wondering how far it'll go between Russia and Ukraine. Joining us from Vienna, Ukrainian human rights activist Inna Shevchenko of the Fenim movement. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
From Washington, Nina Jankovic, a global fellow at the Wilson Center think tank's Kennan Institute. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Former French ambassador to Russia, Claude Blanche-Maison, is with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And from Berdyansk in southeast Ukraine, France24 correspondent Gulliver Cragg. Nice to see you, Gulliver.
Good evening.
The France24 Debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24Debate. Let's start with the latest. First on the Russian side, Russian Federal Security Services releasing footage showing Sunday's standoff near the Kerch Strait, the capture of Ukrainian sailors happening there as Moscow announced the upcoming addition of one S-400 anti-aircraft missile system to the three that are already deployed in Crimea. Gulliver, where you are, does it feel like the escalation is still ongoing?
Well, I did speak to one resident here who said that she could feel a tension in the air and felt very worried about what might happen. But other people have been at pains to stress that the imposition of martial law here in Berdyansk has not made the slightest bit of difference to their lives so far anyway. And that included some soldiers who we spoke to at the military base here who said it was absolutely business as usual for the moment. So, you know, there's a feeling of business as usual. It's very calm here in Berdyansk, but people really don't know what's going to happen. And inevitably, there are certain fears and worries. Though I think the general feeling about President Petro Poroshenko is that he is somewhat exploiting this situation for political purposes and perhaps exaggerating the scale of the threat posed by Russia at this precise moment. Though I think opinions do vary quite a lot, even in this region.
They vary quite a lot. Again, it's day one for 30 days of martial law for those frontline regions. Let's get more now from Aaron Agunke.
Under the threat of full-scale war, it's time for martial law. On Wednesday, Ukrainian authorities began security checks near Donetsk and Lugansk, the breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine. This came just hours after President Petro Poroshenko signed an unprecedented act introducing martial law. Residents of Mariupol expressed concerns both about the implementation of the decree and the possibility of war with Russia.
We never had martial law before, so it's hard to understand. They say that constitutional rights will not be limited, but we don't know what will happen in a week, or 2, or 3.
We can be bombed from the Azov Sea. It's scary. Bombs could fall at any time, so I'm very scared.
In an interview on Ukrainian television on Tuesday, President Poroshenko did not shy away from evoking the worst-case scenario.
The number of Russian units deployed along the entire length of our border has dramatically increased.
After the incident in the Sea of Azov, we had to provide Ukrainian forces with a resistance capability in case there's a large-scale ground invasion.
On Wednesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin firmly placed the blame on Ukraine.
It's clearly a provocation organized by the Ukrainian authorities, and I think by the president himself, ahead of the presidential election scheduled to happen in March of next year.
The Ukrainian parliament voted for martial law in 10 regions along the border for the next 30 days. The measure allows the government to mobilize citizens with military experience, control local media, and strengthen border controls. The flare-up of tensions comes after Russian forces fired on Ukrainian ships Sunday. They seized the vessels and some 24 sailors aboard.
You heard there, Inna Shevchenko, the Russian president, saying a provocation orchestrated by Ukrainian authorities and by the president himself. What's your reaction?
Well, let's make things clear. This provocation is by Russia, not Ukraine. Ukrainian vessels were attacked by Russians. 6 Ukrainian people were injured. More than 20 are captured right now. By all standards, those are acts of breaching of international law, and by all standards, those are war acts. And right now, Putin, and I would speak more about Putin and not Russia. Putin is right now claiming not only sovereignty over Crimea, but also over Azov Sea, which is obviously illegal. And Putin is simply continuing his long strategy of building this, of continuing this provocation, bullying of the West. And Ukraine is simply a territory on which he continues this political wrestling with the West. And Ukraine is a victim of Putin's bullying of the West.
Why now?
Well, we could say that right now we could look at this act of aggression. This act of aggression is 2 things at the same time. It is a new phase of Putin's war in Ukraine, and it is also sort of a final phase, if you want, or a culmination of something that nobody was really caring about, something that was this long strategy of Putin to take over the control over the Kerch Strait, which started with the building of the bridge over the Kerch Strait, and right now he's attempting to take a control over Azov Sea. He's doing a very smart, actually, choice by choosing this area as an area for his political manipulations and aggressions right now, because there is no third party. It's only about Ukraine and Russia. However, he continues by this means, he continues, of course, to tease the West, and this is something that is just simply falls into his
third
strategy
party
of continuous war. Exactly. There is no third party, legal third party in this area.
Claude Blanche-Maison, you agree?
Well, I think wherever the provocation is coming from, and I don't know whether it's coming from Ukraine or from Russia, each of the 2 protagonists are trying to take advantage of it. As far as Poroshenko is concerned, of course, he's running for re-election at the end of March, and it's very important for him to be seen as a really a martial leader, a nationalist leader. And for the first time, he asked the Rada to authorize him to declare martial law. But the Rada was very careful because they limited the martial law for 30 days. He wanted 60 days. So I think the politicians in the Rada are rather careful. And from the Putin side, of course, it's probably rather uncomfortable because he has a G20 meeting at the end of the week, and he will be shown, as the responsible for that. And already Mr. Trump said maybe he will have to reconsider his bilateral meeting with Mr. Putin. But at the same time, he is reasserting that the Azov Sea is something like a Russian lake, which is very source of preoccupation for everybody.
Source of preoccupation. And Nina Jankovic, your thoughts as well on this issue and on the fact that you heard Ina Shevchenko saying that there is no a third party, if you will. It's basically Russia versus Ukraine right now in this part of the world.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think it's important to look at this as a Russian provocation and old school Russian election interference. You know, we talk a lot about bots and trolls these days, but no matter which way this goes, Putin wins in this situation, which is why I think it's pretty clear what side this is coming from. This
but you heard
benefit.
Claude Blanche-Maison there saying how, well, the timing's not great for him, just ahead of the G20 where he's supposed to sit down with Donald Trump.
I don't think that we will see a reaction from President Trump on that front. And I think the Russians that's full of bluster, saying we don't care whether that meeting happens or not. They care, and they know that Trump is the type of leader who wants to sit down man to man with Putin and say, you know, what happened in Ukraine? And we saw President Trump yesterday in his press spray saying, I don't like it either way. Again, not really attributing blame to either side. So I think he's the type of leader that's going to want to go to Buenos Aires and hear Mr. Putin out.
His White House spokesperson in the past few minutes saying that Trump is deeply concerned by what happened. Do you think that it's a sure thing then that meeting can take place in Buenos Aires?
You know what? I think we've had such a back and forth over things like the Khashoggi murder, which are on the same level of international outcry here. And we've still seen engagement from this administration with Mohammed bin Salman. And I think we'll continue to see engagement with the Russians by the Trump White House. I mean, this is an administration that has interfered in our democratic processes. And yet Trump had an unprecedented summit with him in Helsinki that we still don't know what was discussed there. So I'm certain that there will at least be an informal meeting between the two leaders in Buenos Aires.
Nina Jankovic, 48 hours ago, we were discussing what had happened on Sunday, and the general consensus was that it would all calm down after a few days. Now it's Wednesday, and it hasn't. Are you surprised?
No, I'm not surprised at all. I think this is the type of situation that bolsters Putin's internal approval rating. And if he were to give back those ships and those sailors, that would look weak to a lot of his people. And I think that is absolutely anathema to him. It's what the international community should demand, however, because as Ina pointed out earlier, this is a breach of international law. Those ships were not in Russian waters, even if they were within the coordinates of what Russia claims as its maritime border, which is ridiculous anyway, considering that it illegally annexed Crimea. That would be a different story, but they weren't. They were outside of those borders, and as you can see in the video, were shot upon in a completely ludicrous and illegal manner. So I think we need to draw a line here and say to Russia that this type of behavior is unacceptable in the rules-based international order, and that there will be consequences. And I hope that the EU, there was a statement from Mogherini earlier yesterday, I believe, that she was talking to Chrystia Freeland, which I thought was interesting, of course, the foreign minister from Canada. She was talking to her and not necessarily anyone from my own government about how to resolve this situation. So I think we'll be seeing some international coordination. But Putin was very ingenious in the timing of this provocation because the UK, of course, is mired in Brexit negotiations. The United States has many of its own domestic distractions going on right now. And the EU has proven, as you pointed out in your opening remarks, not necessarily capable of handling a response to Russia, a joint response to Russia in the past.
Yeah, we'll talk about that more in a moment. First, I want to ask Gulliver Cragg about the mood. Again, it's Wednesday. It's been several days now. You're in Berdyansk, which is one of the two main ports there on the Sea of Azov that's run by Ukraine. What is the mood?
Well, first of all, if you wouldn't mind, I just wanted to make a point. I don't think it's really appropriate to talk about provocation here from either side, but surely the immediate timing of these events came from Ukraine. It was Ukraine who decided to send these ships through. This is not something that they do every week. They did do it once in September, though, and the Russians let the Ukrainian ships through, and the Ukrainians have every right to send their ships through the Kerch Strait and into the Azov Sea, which are, according to an agreement signed in 2003, jointly shared between the two countries. So the Ukrainians were basically testing once again whether Russia would honor the terms of that agreement by sending these ships through. And well, they got their answer. But I don't think you could call that a provocation on the part of Ukraine, but nor was it a choice of timing that we could see as having come from the Kremlin. I think that that's quite important to remember when we're looking at this. The really alarming thing is that they got their answer already when they found that the passage through the strait was blocked. They turned back, and only then the Russians then fired on these 3 ships and took them captive. As for the atmosphere in Berdyansk, well, it's crucial really for the future of Berdyansk as a viable port that the situation in the Azov Sea is resolved, because as long as Russia controls the Azov Sea, they're carrying out these inspections on ships, which really drastically reduces the viability from a commercial point of view of the Berdyansk port, because these inspections take too much time and cost too much money. Same for Berdyansk and same for Mariupol. So in the longer term perspective, that's what people here are really worried about.
Really worried about? And are you feeling it already? That there's sort of a crippling of the economy?
I know more about what's the situation in Mariupol because I made a report there in July last year, and there are 2 reasons why the Russian bridge over the Kerch Strait is crippling these 2 ports. One is that the larger ships can't fit under them, so companies have to use smaller ships, which of course is more costly per ton. And then there are these inspections that Russian Secret Service boats carry out. Most ships are inspected 4 times, 2 times on the way in, 2 times on the way out. The inspections last for hours, sometimes even for days. The cost, I think, is estimated around 30 million euros per year, but it's quite hard, I think, to calculate because there are other reasons why these ports are losing revenue, particularly Mariupol, because of the conflict, which is just basically outside the city limits of Mariupol is the front line.
When we come back, we're going to take a look at how you unfreeze what seems to many like a frozen conflict, and also, well, that finger-pointing that we've been talking about between the United States and Europe over how much to pressure Russia. Stay with us. You're watching the France24 Debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France24 Debate, and we're looking at neither side blinking in the standoff between Russia and Ukraine, since the Russian fleet directly confronted 3 Ukrainian vessels holding some 24 Ukrainian sailors. With us to talk about it from Vienna, Ukrainian human rights activist Inna Shevchenko, member of the Femen movement. From Washington, Nina Jankovic, global fellow at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, former French ambassador to Russia, Claude Blanche-Maison, is with us, and from Berdyansk in southeast Ukraine, France24's Gulliver Cragg. Yes, some have described it as a frozen conflict, what started with the Maidan revolution in Ukraine, sparked by the then pro-Russian president of Ukraine backing out of a deal to closer ties with the European Union. François Vibaud has this reminder.
Maidan, or Independence Square, a fitting birthplace for Ukraine's emancipation from Russia. In November 2013, thousands rallied to protest then-President Jankovic's alignment with Moscow, cemented by his rejection of a major trade deal with Europe. Facing anti-protest laws and armed riot police, the demonstrators raised barricades and dug in, turning downtown Kiev into a guerrilla war zone for months. As Jankovic fled the country, pro-Russian separatists in the south sensed a power vacuum and took control of government buildings all across Crimea. They were soon joined by thousands of so-called little green men, professional Russian soldiers disguised as citizen militias. In a referendum rejected by the international community, Crimeans voted overwhelmingly to join the Russian Federation. And with Vladimir Putin ordering his troops to now officially enter the peninsula, the annexation was complete. Emboldened by success in the south, in April 2014, separatist militias in eastern Ukraine took up arms and seized power in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, once again with support from Moscow's little green men. Kiev responded with its own military, and the eastern border gradually descended into a bloody stalemate, with daily artillery and gunfire that have now claimed over 10,000 lives. After 4.5 years of simmering conflict, tensions have once again flared up, this time in the Kerch Strait, the disputed channel which separates Crimea from mainland Russia. The Russian Navy fired at and seized 3 Ukrainian ships for allegedly entering their territorial waters. With troops amassed on both sides of the border, Ukraine's Petro Poroshenko declared martial law in the most at-risk regions on November 28, 2018, citing fears of an imminent land invasion. Indeed, a spark is all it could take to ignite the powder keg in one of the most heavily militarized areas on Earth.
Ina Shevchenko, when you think back to the protests and the rallies on Maidan Square in Kiev 5 years ago, did you think it would come to this?
I think that nobody thought it would come to this, but I don't think that people were actually counting on achieving, peace and getting a lot of economical and political prospects right away. I think still that Maidan protests and Maidan revolution, as I call it revolution, had a great results. We see today how mentality of people had changed and how people are indeed liberated themselves from this idea of Ukraine non-existing without Russia and without Kremlin support, and actually identify themselves as a very pro-European nation today. And I think this is the main and very big result of Maidan revolution. And now, of course, Ukrainian people are actually in between of 2 fires, as always they have been. They are right now in between of, on one side, attacks from Putin, from Russia, and they're also very uncertain and very not clear about what they can expect from their own president and their own government. Because we've seen that Poroshenko all of a sudden decided to impose martial law. However, his reasons are very dubious because we've seen that in the previous times where the situation was much more serious. I do not try to suggest that what happened in Kerch Strait is not serious. It is a very serious damage for Ukraine. However, during annexation of Crimea, or for example, when thousands of Ukrainians were dying in Avdiivka or in Ilovaisk, nobody considered even thinking about martial law. Therefore, there is a lot of uncertainty whether it is Poroshenko's beginning of his own presidential campaign, his own way to repress any, his political opponents. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty and fear among people. I have my family who are still living in one of the 10 regions who are right now under emergency regime, and they describe a lot of uncertainty and certain feeling of general chaos. People are just afraid because still nobody really understands what this martial law will mean for them, for their daily life, and what freedoms and rights they are going to give up. Is this a game, political game of Poroshenko? Is this something by which he suggests that he is going to ensure security for people at the cost of their freedoms and rights? I don't think that throughout the history this has ever proved to work. And of course, everybody is thinking about the examples of Egypt, of Thailand, of Philippines, or even Turkey with President Erdogan, who is a quite close friend of Poroshenko. And everybody understands that practice had shown that emergency regimes have tendencies to be extended and sometimes even have tendency to be transformed into systems, anti-democratic systems in the country. So there is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear, and obviously many people are concerned of where are those ideals of Maidan, where are they today? Are they represented by President Poroshenko?
Lots of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate, including this one. Are we yet of the mind that both Putin and Poroshenko are doing all this together to prop themselves up? Poroshenko facing re-election, Putin's popularity dropping currently. He's facing discontent over that pension reform back home. Gulliver Cragg, electorally speaking, what will this do for Petro Poroshenko? And when you listen to Ina Shevchenko, you get the sense it could backfire.
Yeah, I really think it could go either way for him, you know. I mean, there are certainly people who were quite suspicious about his original proposal to bring in martial law. Some people suspected that he was doing it in order to postpone the election that's due at the end of March. He made very clear that he wasn't going to do that and reduced the proposed period of martial law to 30 days. But at the same time, you know, martial law, if all of the provisions that are there in the text of what's written in Ukrainian legislation were to be applied, there's all sorts of restrictions on civil liberties, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, that could be applied. At the moment, the rumor mill is really churning, quite possibly, in fact, almost definitely, I would say, fueled deliberately by Russian input, but not only by Russian input, about those measures possibly being applied, about media being shut down and things like that. There's a lot of suspicion about the possibility of an authoritarian turn, though it's important to stress Petro Poroshenko has said that he won't use any of those measures unless there really is a proper, full-on ground incursion by the Russians. But there is a lot of suspicion of him. On the other hand, some people think that at the end of the day, him being able to stand up and be the strong leader in a time of war is going to play well for him.
All right, we'll see how that plays out. Now, we were mentioning earlier Donald Trump pondering whether or not to meet Putin at the G20 summit this week. The U.S. State Department openly complaining that Washington is shouldering too much of the burden when it comes to Ukraine, that European nations are voting for sanctions but then not applying them. And that's not all. They're also complaining about the building of that gas pipeline that bypasses Ukraine and Poland.
Something we've talked about a fair amount, but perhaps not enough, is Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 is snaking through many of these countries, and I think that's a question European countries have to ask themselves. Is Nord Stream 2 something that they want to continue with because it helps the Russian government, and is that the kind of support that they want to provide the Russian government with continuing to back Nord Stream 2 at this time?
Now, the unnamed target of those remarks is, of course, Germany. And after last month's inauguration of a new pipeline from Russia to Turkey, it's yet another route that would bypass, again, Ukraine and Poland, as you can see from that map. And by the way, the German government spokesperson taking note of the criticism, he says, but nothing has changed. In other words, yes, we're going forward with Nord Stream 2. Do you agree with what the State Department spokesperson is saying there, that the Europeans vote for sanctions but then don't apply them?
Of course, we apply them, but I don't see why we should not build the Nord Stream 2, because it's not under sanction, except if the Americans are going to put new sanctions on that. But apparently, Donald Trump told very bluntly, Chancellor of Germany, that she should not go with this Nord Stream 2, and she should rather buy liquefied gas from the US. So from a commercial point of view, I can understand this position, but the liquefied gas, of course, is much more expensive because it has to be liquefied and then to be gasified at the other end of the. So probably it's more rational to have this pipeline and to bring into European Union, mainly Germany, cheaper gas, of course, and the reliance.
Can it just be business as usual while what we've been talking about in the Sea of Azov is taking place?
But I mean, the concern here seems to be rather a commercial one, as I said, and I understand that the American wants to sell their liquefied gas, but there is competition on this, and after all, I don't see why the Europeans should buy more expensive gas. And the argument of reliance goes both sides, because if Russia is selling gas or oil to European Union, of course, they rely on the revenue of this gas and oil. So the reliance, dependency is works
both ways. Nina Jankovic, who do you agree with, the State Department or Ambassador Blanche-Maison?
Well, I think it's a bit more nuanced than agreeing with one or the other. Clearly, Nord Stream 2 is not a good thing for Ukraine, not a good thing for the eastern boundaries of the European Union. But I have disagreed publicly before with the State Department and the White House's line about Nord Stream 2, because in this case, I do agree with the ambassador that the concern seems to be a bit more commercial than actually concern for dynamics in the region. I think the United States is abdicating its leadership about these issues of rule of law and the rules-based international order when it comes to Russia. And Nord Stream 2 is just about the only thing that Donald Trump will criticize the Russians on. So I think
the statements, though, from the UN ambassador,
clear.
the statements from the U.S.'s UN ambassador and from the State Department, very strong in denouncing Russia this week. And, you know, again, calling for tough sanctions. We're hearing strong words from U.S. diplomats.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, it's important to consider the fact that Nikki Haley is about to end her term as new UN ambassador, and it's been said that Heather Nauert, the State Department spokesperson, is being considered for that job. I think there's been a clear incongruence between what Trump's diplomats and Trump's civil servants do and what Trump himself says, and that paints a very muddled picture of U.S. foreign policy right now and undermines our leadership in the greater region.
And then there's what the French do. The Russian foreign minister was in Paris on Tuesday. There, Sergei Lavrov got reproaches from his hosts, but certainly not the full-scale hairdryer treatment when his French counterpart stepped up to the podium.
I told Sergei Lavrov that a gesture was expected from Russia, that the prisoners and the boats should be released as quickly as possible. But I'm also calling on my Ukrainian counterparts to encourage him to seek ways of de-escalating their sector.
Ina Shevchenko, your reaction to those remarks?
Well, I think that we've seen since 2014 until this latest attack, we've seen that all the reactions from international community had simply failed because if they would be efficient, if they would be effective, I think that we wouldn't be talking, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now, and we wouldn't have this attack, another attack of Russia in Ukraine just a few days ago. So I think that this attack, if someone still was doubting and had any doubts about it, this attack had shown and proved that Putin was not convinced by any of the reaction of international community.
So what should the EU do?
It has been ridiculously weak. Well, I think that right now, instead, that Poroshenko, instead of provoking Putin for more by announcing martial law, and which will only result in Putin, creating for Putin opportunity to double or even triple his military force in the region, Poroshenko has to continue to push on stronger reactions from EU and not just some kind of peace talks that did not prove any results, did not show any results during these years.
Yeah, he was speaking at an economic forum in Moscow earlier. Vladimir Putin expressing hope that he will still be sitting down on the sidelines of the G20 later this week in Argentina with the President of the United States. Donald Trump, Putin describes as having, quote, a generally positive attitude. Putin was also asked about this question of whether or not sanctions were working.
We have no intention of moving away from the dollar. It's the dollar that's moving away from us. And those who make this appropriate decision shoot themselves no longer in the foot, but a little higher. As such, instability in the dollar's calculations causes the desire of many world economies to seek alternative reserve currencies and create payment systems which are independent from the dollar.
Nina Jankovic, your reaction?
Oh, well, I couldn't help but smile there. It's classic Putin deflection and classic Putin describing the world's problems only as they relate to the United States. I think it's clear that sanctions have had an effect on Russia and Russians and the price of goods there. And I think if the international community is able to come together and actually have some sort of cohesive, cooperative sanctions that are gelled together, which we've had a bit of trouble doing, and I anticipate us having further trouble doing, if that were to happen in that ideal scenario, they could really have a harsh effect. But as you mentioned, we have states like Austria and Italy that are becoming more and more reticent to renew the existing sanctions, let alone impose new ones.
Ambassador Blanche-Maison, is it a problem, the fact that you have Matteo Salvini in Italy, who's very close to Russia. Same with the far right, which is currently in a coalition government in Austria.
Yes, let's be clear. I mean, the main concern of Mr. Poroshenko is to be re-elected end of March. The main concern of any Russian leader is to avoid Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. That's very important. And whatever the current discussion is on the incident of last Sunday, that remains the basis.
But has Putin's support of these far-right parties throughout Western Europe succeeded in driving a wedge between EU nations?
Up to now, I mean, Italy, but also Greece and Austria and other countries who are reluctant to sanctions have gone along with the majority of the European Council. And I think what matters is the position of Germany, position of France, position of the major member states, and up to now the other ones have follow the path. And I mean, with the discussion going on between the Italian government and the Commission on budget, I'm not sure that Italy is in a position to veto any kind of majority decision.
And do you agree with Ambassador, that with Nina Jankovic when she says that sanctions have had an impact on Russia?
Well, whatever the leader of the Russian government is saying, yes, I think so, because the Russian elite doesn't like to be under sanction. I mean, you have what the government people are saying. We don't care about sanctions, and we go along, and it's good for self-reliance of Russia. But in fact, the elite of the Russian society, the oligarchs and business people, don't like at all to be under sanctions. So they are putting some pressure to get rid of sanctions, and I'm sure that even Putin wouldn't like to have a more strict sanction, and he would like to find a way to get rid of the economic sanctions.
We heard earlier Ines Shevchenko describing how Ukraine is sort of caught in the middle. Do you feel like the EU is caught in the middle between Russia and the United States, or that?
I mean, we must say, of course, we are good ally of the United States of America, but despite that, the economic interests are not exactly the same. I mean, European Union is the main economic partner of Russia. United States are not at all. I mean, the exchanges are maybe 1/10 of the exchanges between Russia and the European Union. The investment are mostly European investment in Russia. So, and after all, Russia is our neighbor. So, I mean, the economic interest and the general interests are not exactly the same. So that's why probably one day, I don't know when, maybe in a remote future, but I'm quite sure that Russia and the European Union will have to sit down to find some kind of agreement.
Find some kind of agreement, and of course include Ukraine including Ukraine in that process. I want to thank you, Claude Blanche-Maison. I want to thank Nina Jankovic for being with us from Washington, Ina Shevchenko in Vienna, Gulliver Cragg reporting for France24 from Berdyansk in Ukraine. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois.
In journalistic parlance, this is a story that has legs on it.
You could say that. And a lot of the analysis seems to be kind of correlating, so there does seem to be some degree of consensus about what's going on here. In some parts of the world, perhaps because you do have the Russian perspective, I suppose, on what's going on as well, or at least the story as to how all this came to a head. We'll start with Le Monde, and they spoke to a researcher at the French Institute of Foreign Relations, IFRI, Tatiana Kastueva, and she spoke about an unabashed attitude in Moscow when it comes to power. I suppose a rather fearless attitude in some respects. The Kremlin knows that no state will want to expose itself in order to defend the liberty of navigation in this part of the world. No one will go beyond declarations of sort of form, as she said. And she spoke about the official status of the Azov Sea having no reality on the ground. Of course, there was the construction of that Kerch bridge from 2015 onwards, restrictions placed on the freedom to navigate in the sea. So the reality on the ground didn't match, I suppose, the international agreements that predated the Crimean War. What else do we have? We have this piece in Reuters by Peter Apps, and he says that as in the South China Sea, where Beijing has also used giant engineering works to reclaim islands and build military bases.
If you scroll up on that story, maybe we could see the there we go.
Which?
There,
the bridge. Oh, right. This is the bridge in question. In fact, yes, the Kerch bridge linking Crimea and the
It's got that
mainland.
low clearance that we were talking
right,
about.
and started in 2015 construction. It started just within a year of Crimea being annexed. And so what they're talking about here is facts on the ground, if you like, and creating the facts on the ground. So work on the bridge began in 2015. Ukraine and its Western allies must now decide how to respond. This is later in the article. Not to do so, many would argue, would strike Russia as weakness and invite yet more aggression, but no one wants a conflict they can't control. So again, we're hearing echoes of, what should be done but can't really be done. This is Politico.eu. Again, you're seeing the tone and the sort of consensus, if you like. Putin is in control. This is Matthew Karnsteig writing from Berlin. In the EU cocoon, he says, Germans debated whether the UN refugee compact would be legally binding. The French squabbled over the price of gasoline. In the US, lost somewhere in Trump land. So arguably the situation has got worse. But the more brazen Putin becomes, the more helpless the West appears. And he goes on to say the fecklessness of Europe's response is remarkable, even by its admittedly modest standards. So that's a very negative take on the European response. And he also writes in that piece, chalk another one up for Vlad. So it's all looking very, you could even say ominous. Sea of troubles as of emerging as the tinderbox in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This is on the website of Radio Free Europe. And Christopher Miller writes that one is caught between the sea and a hard place here. Melink, the political and security analyst, who this is somebody they interviewed in the article, said Ukraine is in an impossible situation. International law doesn't work there, he said. Ukraine should apply to international courts, but it takes a long time. And as we've already seen, it doesn't help much against Russia. So lots more on that. I suppose the Russian perspective, different universe here. Kiev would get away with eating babies, Putin says. The Kerch Strait standoff is a provocation. And this is what embassies are putting up on Twitter as well, Russia in South Africa here. This is a provocation. It was set up by the incumbent authorities ahead of the upcoming presidential elections to boost ratings. Mr. Poroshenko was only on fifth place in the polls. He might not even make it to the runoff. So that's their line. They're sticking to it, regardless of what analysts seem to agree across the board.
James Creedon, many thanks for that. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 Debate.